They said my garden was an eyesore. The HOA slapped me with a fine so outrageous it felt like punishment for daring to be different. $5,000 for planting what I loved. Neighbors whispered, board members smirked, and it seemed like the community had already judged me guilty. But what they didn't know was that the very thing they called ugly was about to change everything. Overnight, the city stepped in, and the story took a turn nobody saw coming. How does a fine meant to crush you turn into a $500,000 victory? When you first look at Maplewood Estates, it seems like the kind of neighborhood people dream of. Neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, and rows of identical houses that look almost too perfect. Families moved here for peace, for safety, for that sense of belonging that comes from a so-called close-knit community. Among those families was one homeowner who didn't quite fit the mold. They weren't careless or messy. In fact, they took pride in their property. But instead of the manicured green grass and cookie-cutter shrubs that filled every other yard, their garden told a different story. It was vibrant, colorful, and alive in ways the rest of the neighborhood wasn't. At first, people smiled politely, maybe even admired it from a distance. But in a place where conformity was king, anything that stood out long enough was bound to attract attention. And in Maplewood Estates, attention often meant trouble. What began as quiet whispers about the different yard would soon escalate into something much larger. Because in this neighborhood, beauty wasn't measured by creativity or passion. It was measured by rules. And those rules had teeth. At first, the warnings came quietly. Little slips of paper tucked into the mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official logo. Violation notice. Yard maintenance non-compliance. It sounded almost harmless, like a friendly reminder. But the homeowner knew better. Behind those cold words sat a board of neighbors who had already decided what acceptable looked like. The first notice demanded that the wildflowers be trimmed back. Apparently, the blooms were distracting to drivers entering the subdivision. A strange accusation, considering no one had ever reported an accident, and the flowers were planted well off the road. The second notice insisted that the wooden trellis supporting the vines was an unapproved structure. By the third, the message was crystal clear. The HOA wanted the garden gone. What had once been a point of pride was now being treated like a crime scene. The homeowner had poured years of work into cultivating it, importing heritage seeds, researching soil care, even speaking with local historians about plant varieties tied to the region's past. None of that mattered. To the HOA, it was an eyesore. To the homeowner, it was a labor of love. Soon the notices turned into fines. $500 at first, then another. When the balance reached $5,000, the board sent a letter with a threat that cut deeper than any amount of money. Failure to comply could result in a lien on the property. In other words, they were willing to risk forcing someone out of their own home over flowers. The tactics weren't limited to paper threats. Neighbors began to notice board members driving slowly past the house, cameras in hand, snapping photos of the garden as though it were evidence in a crime investigation. A few even whispered that complaints had been made at community meetings, where the garden was described as bringing down property values. The irony was painful. What gave the house its unique beauty was being painted as a burden to the community. Frustration turned to helplessness. The homeowner appealed to the board, attending a meeting to explain the history and care behind the garden. But the response was a wall of blank stares and clipped responses. The decision was already made before the meeting began. The garden, they said, violated uniform appearance guidelines. It didn't matter how well it was kept or how much it meant. The rules, they insisted, were clear. Still, the fight wasn't only about rules, it was about control. Every new notice, every photograph, every whispered remark from a neighbor was a reminder. The HOA wasn't just managing the community, it was policing individuality. And in their eyes, the homeowner's garden was rebellion. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure didn't let up. Letters arrived with increasing urgency. Neighbors who once nodded politely began avoiding eye contact. It was as if standing too close to the rule breaker might draw attention to their own homes. That isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Watching a community once called home turn cold and hostile. But beneath the frustration, something else was building: resolve. If the board wanted to escalate, the homeowner was ready to dig in. They began gathering documentation, photographs of the garden at its peak, articles about historic plants, letters from passers-by who admired the unique space. Each piece of evidence was a shield, a way to fight back against the narrowing grip of conformity. Then came the boldest move yet. The HOA sent notice that if the fines weren't paid in full within 30 days, legal action would follow. That single letter, with its stiff legal jargon, landed like a hammer. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about the right to live freely in one's own home. What the HOA didn't know was that the homeowner had already reached out beyond the neighborhood. The garden wasn't just a personal project. It had roots in the community's high. At first, the warnings escalated quietly, but the fines piled up relentlessly. The homeowner sat at the kitchen table, staring at the growing stack of letters, each stamped with the HOA logo, each more threatening than the last. $5,000 now loomed over them, each notice a reminder of the impossible position they were in. But they refused to back down. The homeowner decided to confront the board directly. At a tense community meeting, papers in hand, they presented the history and care behind the garden. The board chair smirked, confident that their rules would prevail. But each argument the homeowner made chipped away at that confidence, hinting that the coming confrontation would not be so easily won. The battle spilled back into the garden itself. The board chair confronted the homeowner at the edge of the vibrant space, her disdain clear. The homeowner stood firm, calm but defiant. The garden, alive and thriving, seemed to embody their determination, highlighting the stark clash between rigid authority and the freedom to create. The HOA thought they had won. They had stacked fines so high that most people would have broken under the weight. $5,000 in penalties, threats of liens, endless letters typed in stiff legal language. They believed the homeowner was cornered, but what they didn't know was that every piece of paper, every photograph they snapped in secret, every cruel remark muttered at meetings, was fueling something larger than their petty campaign. The breaking point came at a community hearing, called to resolve the ongoing dispute. The board sat at a long table, papers spread out like trophies, confident that the outcome was already decided. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, some curious, others waiting to watch the spectacle of a rule breaker finally being put in their place. The homeowner walked in alone, but not unprepared. As the board chair began listing violations in a monotone voice, the room carried the heavy silence of inevitability. The words were sharp, designed to cut: non-compliance, devalued property, community disruption. Each accusation landed like a stone. But instead of crumbling, the homeowner rose, calm, steady, holding a folder thick with documents. With measured words, they explained what the HOA had refused to hear all along. The garden was not random chaos. It was a curated collection of native and historic plants, some dating back centuries in the region. It wasn't just decoration. It was heritage. They presented photos of the garden at its bloom, letters from local historians confirming its significance, and expert reports highlighting its ecological value. Every sheet of paper placed on the table felt like a stone thrown back at the board. The board shifted in their seats, their polished confidence cracking. They had expected excuses, maybe desperate pleas. Instead, they were staring at evidence. Evidence they hadn't bothered to research, because they never believed they needed to. And then came the moment that shattered the room's silence. The homeowner revealed that the city's Historical Preservation Committee had already reviewed the property. What the HOA had mocked as ugly had been officially recognized as a cultural landmark in progress. The garden wasn't in violation of the community's values. It was about to be protected by laws far bigger than the HOA's rulebook. Gasps rippled through the audience. The board chair's face flushed red. Papers shuffled. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. The board wasn't the hunter anymore. They were the cornered. And then the hammer dropped. The homeowner announced that the city had not only recognized the garden, it had appraised the property's historical value at nearly $500,000. What the HOA had declared worthless, what they had tried to erase, had just multiplied the value of the very home they threatened to take away. The room erupted. Some neighbors clapped, others laughed nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing a victory or a scandal. The board sat frozen, their silence louder than any gavel. Their war against one garden had backfired so spectacularly that it had elevated the very thing they despised into untouchable status. As the meeting adjourned in chaos, neighbors whispered about resignations, about lawsuits, about whether the board even had the right to continue enforcing rules after such a public defeat. The homeowner walked out into the night air, no longer burdened by the weight of fear or fines. Instead, they carried the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes only after surviving the storm. But even in victory, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who watched. If this is what one homeowner had to endure just to protect something beautiful, how many others had been silenced before? The garden was no longer just a garden. Overnight, it became a symbol, not only of resistance against petty authority, but of how fragile the illusion of control really is. When the city declared it a historic landmark and appraised its worth at nearly $500,000, the story rippled through Maplewood Estates like wildfire. For the homeowner, the immediate relief was overwhelming. No more letters, no more fines, no more threats of liens lurking like shadows in the mailbox. The paper trail of harassment that had once kept them up at night now read like a comedy of errors, a record of an HOA that had tied itself in knots only to choke on its own arrogance. But the impact spread far beyond one house. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began asking questions. If the board could so brazenly abuse its power against one homeowner, how many others had been pressured?